Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us and welcome to Uncovering Synergies Between Literacy and Science with Alestra Flores Mendez. We're very excited to have all of you here today. If you want to go ahead and just drop in the chat where you're from, what's your name, what's your role in education, we'd love to hear from you. Hi, Leslie. Nice to see you. Travis, Central PA. I'm from Indiana, and I feel like I never see Indiana in these chats. So if anyone is from Indiana, please let me know.
I'm waiting for the Californians, Ryan.
Oh,
So I
yeah.
see science teachers from New York City, Oregon, Newark, Indianapolis. Hey. Oh, that's you.
That is me. I wasn't going to say anything though, but that is me. Oh, there we
Oh,
got a CA.
there we go.
New York is
I'm
always
Mary
heavily represented in these webinars. So cool to see.
and Janice or Janice. I hope I'm saying your name right. Hey, Jen. Fantastic. And we've got from kindergarten, we've got some college students, educators, we've got high school, middle school. Wow, nice representation. Fourth
Okay.
grade.
It's
Okay.
been a couple minutes, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. Again, everybody, thank you for joining us for Uncovering Synergies Between Literacy and Science with Alestra. My name is Ryan. I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping Zoom notes for us before we get started, and then I'll pass things over to Alestra. So just a few helpful tips. If you would like to access closed captioning during this webinar, you can just head on down to the tray in the bottom of your Zoom and click the CC, that closed captioning button, and subtitles should pop up for you during the webinar. We would love to hear from you all. I know Alestra is going to do some in-chat participation, so feel free to drop any comments that you have in the chat and to participate as the webinar goes along. However, we are using the Q&A feature for this webinar. So if you have any questions, please pop those over in the Q&A. And if time permits, we'll answer some of those questions at the end. You will receive a credit, a certificate of attendance from Zoom, as well as a recording from this webinar as well. So please keep an eye out for that email during the next couple of days. With that being said, I'd love to introduce all of you to Alestra, who is the Director of Multilingual Initiatives here at Amplify. She has over 20 years of experience in education with over diverse contexts, and she has served as a Spanish dual immersion teacher and literacy coach while also designing curriculum for the UC Berkeley's Lawrence Hall of Science. So Alestra, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'm going to go ahead and pass things over to you.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm going to go ahead, folks, and get started. Thank you so much for kind of introducing yourselves in the chat. It's nice to see that we have folks from all over the country and from, kindergarten all the way up through college here. So very excited to share with you the synergies between literacy and science. I like to start off just with a quote. It's actually kind of a conversation, a couple of quotes between the principals investigators who created Amplify Science, Jackie Barber and P. David Pearson. And in a conversation they had, P. David Pearson mentioned that literacy is a domain that's in search of content. We engage in literacy, with purpose. We want to engage in content. And then Jackie Barber responded, but actually engaging in science requires literacy. So it's this beautiful synergistic relationship. And we're going to be exploring that relationship today. So I want to start us off just thinking about, literacy, because literacy builds on language skills. Language skills are innate, they're natural, typically developing children, you know, they will start to, you know, mimic the sounds that they hear, you know, at a very young age before any formal schooling. And so we think about sort of receptive language as, you know, the listening, that young children, you know, they're listening and then they're producing language. A lot of times, you know, repeating what's been modeled for them. And this happens very naturally. But formal education is required for reading and writing. These are skills that, you know, we need to explicitly introduce our students to. We need to provide that explicit instruction for students to become readers, for students to become writers. And so I wanted to kind of engage you in a little sort of thought experiment here. What does it feel like, you know, to become a skilled reader? And so one of the things that we know from research is that one of the first steps in reading is we have to convert written words into speech. So if we think about sort of, you know, in our brains, we definitely have a speech center, but when we take into our vision center sort of print, we need to sort of decode that. We need to figure out sort of what are all of the sounds represented, you know, by these letters that we see. And so what you see in front of you is a phrase in Hawaiian. And if you are a fluent Hawaiian speaker, don't give away the punchline, please. But just thinking about how would we decode this phrase? And you might be familiar with maybe one of the words or some of the sounds, but I'm going to explain a little bit about the code of the Hawaiian language so that you can try to decode this phrase. In Hawaiian, the vowel sounds are a, e, I, O, U. If you speak Spanish, you know that we have the similar vowel sounds in Spanish, or if you speak Japanese. So I'll repeat the vowel sounds again. A, O, U. So when you see a vowel, you can decode it. It's a very transparent language, Hawaiian, the way that it's decoded here. But there's something I need to explain. When you see vowel pairs, for example, the AI or the OU, we call those diphthongs, they make a different sound. They make one single sound. So the AI is going to make the I sound, and the OU is going to make the O sound. So, okay, now that you're sort of kind of figuring out the vowel sounds, I'm going to tell you all of the consonants you see here are the same sounds that you would encounter in the consonants in English. So, M for the letter M, or K for the letter K. So you're getting kind of closer there, but you might be curious, well, what about that line over the letter A? How is that going to change the sound? So when you see the kahako, or that line over the vowel ah, it's going to extend that vowel. So it would be ah. So go ahead and try, knowing the sort of a little bit of the code of the Hawaiian language, if you can decode this phrase. And I'm going to go ahead and read it for you as well. Aloha mai kako. So maybe you were able to kind of get that on your first try, but thinking about sort of children, and when children are coming into formal education, this is sort of the process they need to go through. What are the sounds of our language, and how are those sounds represented by letters? How are those letters sort of, you know, blended to form words? And how do words convey meaning in a phrase like this? But knowing that this says aloha mai kako is not enough. We also need to understand the language, right? We need to understand, you know, what does that message sort of convey? And so decoding is part of the process, but also language comprehension, understanding the language, is a necessary element as well. And so I'll share with you all what this means. This is a greeting in Hawaiian, and what this greeting means, roughly translated, is I am extending my goodwill to all of you, and also to myself. And so knowing that, you know, this is how we pronounce this phrase, aloha mai kako, and that the phrase means, you know, an extension of goodwill to all of us here, we can kind of see a little bit of the process that students need to go through to not only decode and understand what they're seeing represented in text, how those kind of mechanics work, but also, you know, what does that mean, and how are we helping students gain meaning from text? So there's another framework. Oh, and let me just mention quickly, this comes from Goff and Tumner's Simple View of reading. This is research that Goff and Tumner came up with this in the 1980s, but this particular idea of the simple view of reading has been validated in hundreds of studies and in several alphabetic languages, for example, like Spanish. So wanted to kind of point out, where does this framework come from before introducing you to another framework or visual representation of how literacy develops. So this is what is called the reading rope. It was developed by Dr. Hollis Scarborough. And one thing that we're going to be looking at here is sort of these components of language comprehension. Now, we just had a little simulation about word recognition, right? How are, sounds represented by letters? How are those letters combined to form words? And how do we decode those, knowing the code of a language? But we're going to be looking at language comprehension now, the different components of it. And I need to pause sort of to mention that when we think about language comprehension, it's not a discrete skill. Language comprehension is a set of complex cognitive processes. And we're going to be looking at these different cognitive processes and how we can develop that in our students through the synergistic relationship of literacy and science. So I'll kind of just, hopefully you can see this on your screen here. But we have, for example, knowledge on that top strand of language comprehension. How are students developing knowledge, vocabulary, sentences, reasoning, and forming mental models? So we just experienced a language completely new to most of us. And we kind of looked at the complex processes and skills, to become skilled at reading that passage. It was difficult, right? And if we think about this, is not only difficult, for example, for our multilingual learners who may be new to the English language, but it's also new to it's also complex for our students who are novices to the language of science. And we're going to be looking at the language of science together today as well. So let's use this framework from Hollis Scarborough to better understand, what knowledge and skills are required to make meaning of the language of science. So I'd like us to start with that very first strand in the rope, which is knowledge. So before I move forward, I'm going to open my chat here, and I'm curious, anybody here on this call, I know we have a lot of science educators, but I'm curious, are any of these two frameworks, the simple view of reading or Hollis Scarborough's rope, familiar to any of you science educators out there? So let me go ahead and open this up. I love the floating thumbs ups. So hopefully you folks can see that we've got lots of thumbs up. Yes, as an elementary teacher, right, as we're generalists, right? And so knowing it all, thank you. I'm so happy to hear that this is familiar. And I love that we're going to kind of connect the new to the known with how does this refer, how does this relate to science? Wonderful, thank you. Oh, we've got instructional specialists. We've got emojis with heart eyes. Yes, I love this too. Oh, and literacy cake. That's a wonderful term I'm going to continue to use in my presentation. So thank you for that, Vernon. Okay, excellent. So I'm happy to hear that this is a familiar framework for some of you, and it might not be for some others. So I'll be sure, to take that into consideration. But let's look at that first strand of the rope, the knowledge component. And I would like to share with you some additional research. So what we've learned from research is that reading comprehension is largely knowledge-based. And today we're going to be talking about building student science knowledge. But first, I'm going to share with you a study done by Rhett and Leslie, again in the 1980s. They were investigating the impact background knowledge had on students' reading comprehension. So they published this study that's known as the baseball study. And you feel free in the chat, if you're familiar with the baseball study, you can give me a thumbs up as well. And please don't, take tell the answers when I give the quiz. So in the study, there were fourth grade students that were divided into separate groups. The investigation, of course, was let's see how students' background knowledge is going to, impact their reading comprehension. And in these four groups, there were strong readers. So what we see there is there were some strong readers, this top orange group, that were also very knowledgeable about the sport of baseball. Maybe they played Little League, maybe they watched games with their family, or they went to ball games. So they were strong readers and they knew a lot about the sport. And then there were other students, and this is the top purple group here. They were also strong readers, those decoding skills, right? They could decode beautifully. They weren't familiar with the sport of baseball. They'd never played the game. They'd never watched the game. And then we had two other groups. One group, the purple group down there on the bottom, they actually were very knowledgeable about baseball as well. And so they had a lot of background knowledge, but they weren't the strongest readers. They actually had a difficult time with reading. And then the final group was a group of students who were also challenged by reading, but they also didn't know much about baseball. So these were the four groups of students, and I'd love for you in the chat to share in a comprehension assessment. So what this looks like is a student would read a passage about, a baseball game, and they'd be given some questions to answer. Who performed the best on that comprehension assessment of these four groups of students? And I'm going to go ahead and look over here in my chat to see sort of what are the responses. Thank you. Yeah, and it pretty much, there's a consensus here, folks. I'm seeing a consensus that the students with the high reading ability and also the deep knowledge of the sport of baseball, they perform the best. And as you can see here, with this data, what it's showing us is that they had 86% accuracy on that comprehension assessment. So the background knowledge really supported them. Their decoding really supported them. But here's the question that I'd like you to think about now is, okay, well, who was the group that kind of came in just behind that group of students? Was it the students who performed sort of next best, the students who were strong readers, but they just didn't know a lot about the sport? Or was it the students who were not strong readers, but they had a lot of background knowledge about baseball? So I'm going to look here. Oh, and I'm seeing a lot of low reading proficiency, but high knowledge. Okay, not strong readers, but they had good background. Okay, I'm also seeing a consensus here. You folks are really good. Okay, so let me show you the data. What you might find surprising is that the students who, you were right, they weren't the strongest readers, but they knew a lot about baseball. They actually performed inches behind the other group. They had 81% accuracy on their responses to those comprehension questions. And I think about this, trying to imagine, I was a classroom teacher for many years. Sometimes you sit with a student and the student might read something like the short stop, had a difficult time maybe with that compound word. But when they read the word shortstop, though they kind of were labored in doing it, when they read that the shortstop, saved the game in the 9th inning, they know what's going on. The student who read that beautifully, it was the bottom of the 9th inning and the shortstop saved the game, but they don't know what a shortstop is. They don't know what an inning is. They weren't able to really comprehend what was happening in that passage. And interestingly, even though they were very strong readers, they only answered about a little over half of those comprehension questions accurately. So I think that, the baseball study is a really nice example of how we can leverage what it is that we know when we're coming into reading a piece of text. And particularly, we're talking about texts are very complex when we're talking about science texts, right? And having some background knowledge to support students. So I want to sort of ground this conversation about literacy in the next generation science standards. So I'm just really quickly gonna, for anybody who's on the call and not familiar with the NGSS, which Amplify Science was built on the framework as well as for the next generation science standards. kind of just talk about what, when we're saying next generation sciencers, how do we help students to understand science phenomenon, that is in our natural world, and to, engage in science in the way that scientists do. So one of the things we talk about with, having a three-dimensional approach to explaining science phenomenon is using the practices that scientists use. One of the ways I kind of paraphrase this is, the work that scientists do. Scientists, they conduct investigations, they model, but they also read scientific, journals. What are other things that help students build their understanding of science? Well, it's understanding those disciplinary core ideas, right? What is it that we're trying to figure out here? What is it that scientists want to know? And these are sort of like those content standards we can think of in science. And another thing that I think we want to keep in mind here is the third dimension, right, of those cross-cutting concepts that span across multiple disciplines. But, specific to science, how do scientists think when they're engaging in investigating? And when they are creating models, what are the things that they're thinking of when they're looking for patterns? So we're going to be looking at the kind of the meeting point between sort of, let's look at sort of how scientists do their work, how we want to engage our students in these kinds of practices, core ideas, and cross-cutting concepts, but with respect to literacy. So here is a resource that, Ryan, if you have not already kind of shared this with folks, this would be an opportune time, if you wanted to put that in the chat. But what we've done here at Amplify is we've worked with the Lawrence Hall of Science. So there's a really deep partnership, and the Lawrence Hall of Science has published a white paper. And what they've done is they've looked at the reading rope, particularly with language comprehension, and what does that look like in science specifically? So go ahead, I'm going to give you folks a minute to go ahead and download the resource that Ryan just added there in the chat. You can see the this image that I have here on the screen is, Hollis Scarborough's rope, and then looking at the strands of language comprehension with respect to science. And we're going to kind of get started in just a moment. I want to make sure I give everyone kind of a chance to access that. Okay. So feel free, if you want to just kind of download that or have it kind of, in a tab there on your computer. As I go through, I'm going to be talking about each of these different strands and what does that look like in science. So let's look at the first strand. We talked a little bit about, the baseball study and building that background knowledge, but what do we mean when we're building background knowledge with our students? So one of the things that we want to do is give students, that experience with real world phenomenon, have them engaging with disciplinary core ideas. We also want to introduce our students to sort of the work that scientists do, building their knowledge about how do scientists, what is the endeavor of science? How do scientists, for example, make observations? How is it that scientists engage with texts, or how do they record data from their investigations and organize that data? What are the ways in which scientists communicate orally or in writing? So that's one of the things, the knowledge that we can help students building. I can definitely share a link to this presentation for Cheryl's question at the very end. What you see here is, ways that we help students build knowledge by engaging in firsthand investigations. So here we see that these girls are, exploring with an investigation. Other ways that we build students' background knowledge is through text, through science texts, and, not just the text that they see, but also, the captions, the labels, the descriptions, the visual representations that they're seeing. Okay, awesome. Another thing, so I'm going to go ahead and kind of construct our own rope here. So we talked about, right, knowledge. Let's talk about vocabulary. As we know, vocabulary is so key to understanding concepts in science. So I'm just going to ask in the chat if you folks want to go ahead and drop in the chat um, a recent word that you engaged your students in understanding in your science instruction. So let's see what are some of the science specific vocabulary words. And as you're doing that, we want to talk about sort of, these are, I love it. Look at these beautiful words: subduction, carnivore, observe, equilibrium, homeostasis. We want our students to have control over these domain specific words. We also want them to understand, how some of these words are generalizable. Equilibrium, we might use equilibrium, to discuss multiple science concepts. Climate, thank you. Intrusive, extrusive. This is a great totality. Love it. So, folks, we have an eclipse coming up soon on the 8th of April, of a total solar eclipse that I hope some of you will have an opportunity to see. And if you cannot see it live, you'll watch some videos or kind of maybe some news reports about, what people observed during that eclipse. But, thinking about whenever we're talking about a particular phenomenon, we want our students to have, very precise and specific words to explain that phenomenon. And so we introduce our students, to science specific vocabulary. And again, that is, part of this rope. And that is something that we want to be sure that we're very intentional about as we are, getting our students engaged in the literacy and science. Notice that it's kind of like hand in hand synergy there. Okay, I'm going to build on another strand here. And this is, oh, thank you so much. Ryan just added in the chat, if you didn't see already, a total a solar eclipse activity from our Amplify Science curriculum. And there's also some really cool math extensions in that activity as well. So we're going to move into something that, we looked at that Hawaiian phrase, right? But let's talk about what do sentences look like in science? Because science has a particular way of not only just, dealing with precision in the words and the vocabulary, but also in like really the sentence structures. How do we formulate explanations or arguments? Well, there's a particular way that we structure language. One of them is with explanations. And so for all of you K2 folks out there, we can really scaffold sort of this kind of explanatory language use with kind of scaffolds like this. The object blocked light from the sun, and so it made a shadow. So that's maybe how we would engage students with sentence structure, very young students, giving them these scaffolds and letting them sort of practice hearing the language of science, producing the language of science, doing it in steps, maybe even providing visuals and illustrations to support their understanding of this complex sentence structure. And let's look at kind of how students graduate on up. So I'd love for you just to take a moment to look at some of the sentence complexity in this student response to a prompt about, what are the conditions that cause a lunar eclipse? So go ahead and just take a moment, and hopefully you can see it large enough on your screen to read that. But what might make some of this, this sentence structure complex for students? Marie, I love it. The light from the lamp is blocked by the flower, so it creates this shadow. I'm very familiar with that first grade unit. Thanks for sharing. Oh, I'm so sorry, Delaware. Hang in there. Just know that there is going to be, Jennifer, there's going to be a video. So if you miss parts of it, you can definitely watch the video. Stay safe out there in Delaware, folks. So yeah, what are some of the things in this passage that are kind of complex? A little more complex than maybe, the first example we saw. Yeah, introductory clauses. Thank you, Shannon. When they line up this way, comma. Thank you for that. Yeah, and I'm going to go, if in case folks can't actually see this, especially if you're kind of in the middle of a storm there, that let's go kind of just take a look at that last sentence. When they line up in this way, Earth blocks the sunlight and the moon goes dark. eclipses only happen on the night of a full moon, comma, because the full moon is the phase when the sun, earth, and moon line up with earth in the middle. There's a lot in that sentence. So we've got these introductory clauses. We've also got sort of a series of, we have to keep in mind, right? The earth, the moon, and the sun and their relationship to one another. We've also got sort of like, that spatial reasoning. We've got time happening here as well, in this passage. And so the sentence structure is very complex. So we've got to unpack. Thank you, Danielle. We've got to unpack the sentence. What is going on here? We might have to take it in small chunks where, with the younger students, we took a single sentence into small chunks. With the older students, it might be very supportive for this complex sentence structure, to support them using sentence frames, giving them opportunities to hear us use this kind of sentence structure in oral language before we expect them to produce it themselves or to write in this way. So thank you for that. I'm going to go ahead and add on another strand here, folks. So now what we're going to look at in this sort of the science specific reading rope here is reasoning. And we know that this is just such a huge part of, getting students to explain phenomenon, to construct arguments. So let me go ahead and add my reasoning strand here. And if you could just in the chat, just what are your thoughts on, helping students, to reason in science? What are some of sort of the strategies that you use to support students, to reason, maybe around, how a claim supports evidence, for example? I'm sorry, how evidence supports a claim. I was too busy making my little twist tie here. Yeah, science seminars, graphic organizers, modeling for them. Thank you. Oh, lovely. Excellent. Questioning, cause and effect, right. Asking how and where they can find evidence using science words, always showing a video. Thank you for showing that. So key to provide those models for students. Either you're demonstrating or we're showing them videos. And here what we see is, when students are reasoning, giving them oral opportunities to talk with one another and to reason in groups, having a Socratic seminar, as we see here for the students. And I love that, always trying to show something with a visual. So I'm going to show you a few visuals that we use to support students when they are engaging in reasoning. And this can be used orally, or this can be used when students kind of now commit their thoughts to writing, but using a reasoning tool. So how does the evidence support, or how does the evidence kind of refute the claim? So that's one way we can support. Another visual you see here is what we call an evidence gradient. So asking students, the strongest kind of evidence that you have from which source, and maybe sorting it using cards or kind of writing out. The evidence that most strongly supports this claim is this piece of evidence from this particular source. So these are resources that we use to help students, with that verbal reasoning, that's also, that conceptual reasoning, right? So we can do it through discussion. We can also do it through these graphic organizers. So thank you for sharing such wonderful tips for everyone. All right, I am going to go ahead and go to the final strand here in our Scarborough's rope model that I'm creating over here. But when we see the last strand there says mental model, if you can't see that on your screen. And when we're talking about mental models in science, it's unique, right? Because students are observing or explaining or arguing. And so how do we help them construct mental models to understand and to communicate science ideas? So some of the ways that we can help students to form these mental models of science phenomenon is using simulations. So I noticed there are a couple of Amplify science users out there, but yeah, the simulations are a great way for students to see, things happening in action that they might not be able to see with the naked eye, either because they're too small, too large, the time frame is enormous. So simulations are a great way to help students to make those mental models, to understand and be able to express, what is happening. Another way that we can support students in making mental models is, through when they're reading text, whatever kind of text that we're reading. We might be creating, making models in our mind about what is happening in a process. And in science text, it's so beautifully rich. When we talk about text, I mean, we're also considering the images and the diagrams, the captions. So there's lots of rich information, that can support students in making those mental models, to be able to understand and communicate. And then, when we're asking students to make their own models or to express their own understanding. Okay, so taking kind of what you're conceptualizing here about this phenomenon, and now, putting that, forming a model, doing an illustration, a drawing, a diagram, labeling it, taking that mental model from here and putting it out in the real world on paper, or, digitally. So just gonna sort of pause there for a moment. We've fully constructed our language comprehension component of the of Hollis Scarborough's rope with respect to science. And I'd love sort of, if there's sort of any things that kind of stood out to you, any ahas, let's go ahead and share out together in the chat. Kind of what stood out to you, sort of looking at the Hollis Scarborough's rope, as many of you are familiar with, but with respect to science. Esther raised a hand. Hi, Esther. Having or helping them reason through ideas. Lots of visuals. So yeah, when we're thinking about science with respect to the rope, those visuals are really important, and the reasoning. The gradient organizer. Oh, good. I'm glad that that was helpful for you. And those mental models. Yeah, when I see mental models specific to science, it takes me to a different place than maybe if a student was reading, a novel. Okay. Oh, and you're also going to say visuals. Yeah, the visual is so important in science, and so helpful in constructing understanding. And then you also thought breaking down the sentence. Yeah, because the sentence structure, the language of science is a complex language. And it's new to our students. They're language learners of the language of science. So thank you for breaking that down. Deliberate planning and work for students to be successful. So yeah, I love that you mentioned that. It's sort of like we have to be very meta when we're preparing, to present this to our students, because it sort of, we have to constantly respond to, are they understanding? Are there some misconceptions that we need to clear up? And not just with, the science concepts, but also with the language. Thank you. And providing those scaffolding. I'm really glad that was helpful. Reducing, yeah, I really like scaffolding that rigor for them. So we're going to move into another kind of research base that you folks might also, purposeful instruction. Totally with you, Jen. This is disciplinary literacy. I'm curious if this is a term familiar to you folks. I remember, when I first learned about disciplinary literacy when we were working on the science curriculum, and it was really enlightening to me that it's sort of like the way in which different people use literacy is reflected on like kind of what is the domain that they're talking about. So for example, this disciplinary literacy, these are specialized literacy skills across different domains that has been studied by Shanahan and Shanahan. Some of you might be familiar with their work, but they found different skills and strategies are required depending on the discipline. So for example, if you consider a historian who studies and writes about the invention of books in the ancient world, they're going to engage with literacy in a particular way. A mathematician who's engaging with mathematics to explain certain principles is going to engage with literacy in a specific way as well. Or the astronomer who kind of is explaining how stars came to be and civilization's relationship to the stars is going to be using different skills and strategies of literacy for that purpose. And we mentioned also the novels, right? Novels, the way a novelist wants to engage us in a story, they're going to be using literacy very differently than the ways that we've been kind of talking about, we do when we're having students sort of explain phenomenon. So here, what I'd like you to see is these are some examples talking about visuals, but the kind of literacy that is used in science you see in these images. So I'm going to ask you to think about these specialized skills really with respect to science. And we're going to do a kind of something different now. We're in the chat. I'm going to give you a question and I'm going to ask you to type your response, but wait until I say go to do what's called a chatter fall. So I'm going to go ahead and, once I show you the prompts, you can go ahead and start typing, but please hold on for a second till I say go. I want to give everyone a chance to kind of put their ideas together, and then and the word will be go, and we'll all press enter. But here's the prompt. How do scientists apply literacy skills to build knowledge? And you can use these images to kind of support your thinking. And give folks a minute. Okay, take about 10 more seconds. What do you see the scientists doing here, using literacy to build their knowledge? Okay, feel free to go and let's see what some of these ideas are. So I'm going to scroll back and kind of read some of these out. Yeah, they're actually reading. I love that it says reading the data. Yes. Modeling, using words in context. And there's, oh, I love it, the inquiry and the collaboration, because when we think about literacy, again, it's listening, it's speaking, it's reading, and it's writing. So thank you for bringing out that collaboration. Let's document our observations. Let's use some simulations, and there's language involved there. Graphics. Oh, I love the realia. I love that word. And then, that communication piece. Thank you. And thank you for bringing the students in, because these are real world scientists. But yeah, thank you for kind of giving me that segue, because now we're going to talk about, well, how do we get students engaging in these literacy practices, right, to help them build their knowledge in science? And I love the active engagement. Yeah, we want, we see that the scientists, it's really important to realize that sometimes, you see this first scientist here in a quiet room reading maybe a science journal. It's not all, students sometimes have that misconception, right? That it's all like the scientist is always in their lab. No, we have scientists in the field. We have scientists in, doing some quiet reading. We have scientists engage in writing. So yeah, thank you so much. Wow, there's so many great responses. I welcome all of you to kind of take a little scroll through. And bringing back some of the strands. I see vocabulary in there also. So thank you. So yeah, let's take it to the students. So when we think about disciplinary literacy, with respect to our students, we want to be engaging our students in literacy activities, that are authentic, right, to the practice of science. And when they're reading, it's purposeful. We're going to be engaging in this text to find evidence or to answer a question, really science-specific engagement with text. And then, that explicit instruction around those complex sentence structures, but also, vocabulary. Let's make sure that, we're contextualizing the vocabulary instruction, but that we actually do explain, the precision of what does this word mean in this scientific context. So I'm going to give you a few student-friendly sort of or student-focused kind of examples of this. But, the work that we saw those scientists do. Some of the scientists, they were in their lab and they were conducting investigations. And this is what scientists are doing. And thank you, Jen. Yeah, I love that, Janice. I hope I'm saying your name right. But, learning from mistakes. It's like, okay, I heard there's a podcast if you get a chance to listen to, and maybe Ryan can drop it in the chat. But we had several episodes that you could listen to called Science Connections. And I remember the host of that podcast, Eric Cross, saying, there are no mistakes in science, only data. I just love that. So yeah, these students are, they're collecting data, they're conducting investigations, and things might not go the way they want to, but hey, that's data for them. So this is one of the ways in which we engage students in authentic science and using literacy for that discourse, right? So those conversations that students are having, whether it's an informal sort of a turn and talk, a sense-making opportunity, or a more formal, bring all of the work that you've done, to formulate this scientific argument and really, come here ready to support, your claims with the evidence that you've gathered. We can engage students in this type of discourse. Also text is another way that we authentically engage students, and we share with students, this is what scientists do. They read the work of other scientists, and they might find that supports what their understanding, or we might find maybe it changes their mind because they've learned something from what they've read, and that's a wonderful thing, to engage students in reading those complex texts and supporting them, providing that scaffolding. Also, the writing that scientists do is it's very authentic that scientists, they spend a lot of time writing. They spend a lot of time writing proposals, so that they can fund their research, or they write arguments, they write explanations. And so we engage our students in this as well. So we see here, these students are, maybe they're writing to make sense of an investigation that they just conducted, or they're writing, to explain the model that they just designed or developed, or maybe they are writing a more formal explanation or an argument. And of course, there are lots of ways in which students can visualize to understand science concepts, whether it's, diagrams in a text, or, using a simulation, helping students again with that mental model. So thinking about the ways in which scientists engage in literacy, we want our students to authentically engage in literacy practices as well. And so I'm going to go ahead and share with you a final framework. This framework is pertinent to our elementary as well as our middle school curriculum here at Amplify. But when we think about the ways in which we engage students with phenomenon-based instruction, using those next generation science standards, we want it to be multimodal. One of the things I love about this kind of instruction is that not only, does it engage students in literacy specific to science and to develop their scientific literacy while they're developing their literacy in science, but it offers multiple entry points to different students. For some students, they need that processing time to talk about ideas and things that they're thinking about, or they need to listen to other perspectives before they feel comfortable kind of committing to writing their ideas. For a lot of English learners, it's super helpful to have a hands-on opportunity, or to watch those videos and to sort of see realia, and then listen to the conversations, to support their own language development. Or, students who with special needs, they might need multiple touch points. As maybe they need to see a hands-on investigation or engage in one, but they also need kind of, okay, the text kind of made it a little more clear for me. This can support all of our students. But what I hope that you see here is that by providing students with, all of these authentic ways in which scientists engage with science ideas, as well as literacy ideas, it really helps them to build their science knowledge. So my final point here, before I turn it over to Ryan to share some additional resources with everyone, is one of the things that we want to do, and this is not only specific to science, this is true for all domains in education, all, you know, science, literacy, math is, I love that this comes from our Desmos math group. In education and in our curriculum and in our, you know, in the programs that we have, we want to increase access students have to building knowledge. And while we're doing that, we want to eliminate barriers. For example, we talked about maybe if the multilingual learners, how do we support scaffolds? We want to remove the barriers, but we also want to increase the access, but we don't want to, what we don't want to do is we don't want to reduce the demand of the task. We want our students to have access to high quality, rigorous science education, because as we all know, we need our future scientists and engineers. So I leave you with sort of this idea of the synergies between literacy and science. I'm going to go ahead and turn the floor over to you now, Ryan. I just want to say thank you all for being here with us today.
Thank you, Alestra. That was absolutely wonderful.
Thanks, Ryan.
Well, it does not look to me as though we have any questions for the Q&A, so I'm just going to go ahead and hop in and share those resources with everybody. I'm dropping these links in the chat, and I will drop them in again later as we kind of start to close out. But if you would like to access the resource bundle, the science and literacy resource bundle that Alestra shared, head over to amplify.com/science-literacy-bundle. And you can download that resource bundle and access the research and the discussion guides, so you can go ahead and have those important conversations with your colleagues as well. If you would like to access free science and literacy sample lessons from Amplify Science, you can head over to amplify.com/science-and-literacy-classroom-activities. We've got a whole bunch of grade banded activities for grades K through 2, 3 through 5, and 6 through 8. And those are each activities were taken out of the Amplify Science curriculum. So it'll give you a great look of not only what is available in Amplify Science, but also how you can start to blend science and literacy in your classroom. As Alestra mentioned, we do have a solar eclipse activity. That solar eclipse is happening next Monday. So if you would like a solar eclipse activity, go to amplify.com/solar-eclipse-activity. And if you're interested in learning more about Amplify Science, please head over to amplify.com/science. If you're a current Amplify Science user, we'd love to have you join our Facebook community. We always have great conversations going on in there, people reaching out for questions, people sharing their successes, just a whole bunch of amazing conversations going on in there in the Amplify Science community Facebook page. So you can join that Facebook group by heading over to facebook.com/groups/Amplify Science community. And I will go ahead and drop those links in the chat again. But with that being said, thank you all so much for joining us today. It was absolutely wonderful to have all of you. Again, Alestra, thank you. You were such a phenomenal guest to have for this webinar. Always appreciate you.
Thank you.
Okay. Everybody else, thank you so much for joining us, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day. Bye.